Hello, boys and girls. Got another video for you fine folks on the internet today. Another installment yet in the Matthew Buckley Talks music series. It's been a little while, but here we are once more. And today we're looking at another early 60s rock pop album. Today is one that I'm sure most of you are at least vaguely familiar with. Meet the Beatles, by the Beatles, issued on Capitol Records. Might as well get comfortable because I got quite a list here for the issues. It was first issued in early 1964, January to be specific, 1964, on mono vinyl by Capitol Records in the U.S., Mexico, and Jamaica. And it was also issued in Japan on red vinyl. And there was also a concurrent stereo vinyl issue in the U.S., as well as a 4-track stereo cartridge, and two separate reel-to-reel issues, a 3 3/4 inch per second 4-track stereo 5-inch cinereel tape, and a 3 3/4 inch per second 2-track mono 5-inch cinereel tape. And then the next year, in 1965, it was reissued on both mono and stereo vinyl for both U.S. and Mexican markets. The Mexican import being issued under the title Conozca a the Beatles, which makes sense. And that same year, it was reissued on reel-to-reel tape, this time on 3 3/4 inch per second 4-track stereo 7-inch cinereel tape instead of 5-inch. And then the next year, in 1966, there was a mono vinyl repress for U.S. markets, and another Japanese reissue distributed through Odeon Records, and once again on red vinyl. And the next year, in 1967, Odeon Records also issued a Colombian import vinyl under the title Las Escobas que Cantan. And that same year, the album was issued as an 8-track cartridge, and also as in both mono and stereo vinyl represses in United States, Canadian, and Japanese markets. The Japanese presses done in both red and black editions, and both of those were issued by Odeon Records. And that same year, it was also issued as a play tape EP, a sort of abridged, shortened EP edition of the album, featuring only the tracks All I've Got to Do, It Won't Be Long, This Boy, and All My Lovin', which I think is it's a very strong clutch of tracks to put together, but it's still an interesting choice given what other songs were on here. And then, after that, in 1968, in the following year, it was reissued as an 8-track cartridge, and that same year it would also see its first ever cassette issue, both by Capitol Records, along with a stereo vinyl reissue for U.S. markets. And the next year, in 1969, there would be another 8-track cartridge reissue for U.S. markets. And that same year, we would see another stereo vinyl reissue for both United States and Canadian markets. And then that same year, Apple Records, the record label that the Beatles themselves had founded in 1968, would get a chance to reissue the album on mono vinyl. However, first it was issued by Apple exclusively in Japan, once again on alternatively red or black vinyl pressings. And then the next year, in 1970, there was another Mexican import vinyl reissue, once again under the title Conozca a the Beatles. And that same year, Apple Records would reissue the album in Japan once more, again on both red vinyl pressings and black vinyl pressings. And that same year, Odeon Records would reissue the album on vinyl for Venezuelan markets, which I find interesting. And before the end of the year, Capitol Records would issue the album on reel-to-reel once more on 7.5 inch per second 4-track stereo 7-inch cinereel tape for U.S. markets. The next year, in 1971, Capitol Records would reissue the cassette of the album in the United States, and then Capitol and Apple Records would jointly reissue a stereo press of the vinyl for U.S., Canadian, and Dominican Republic markets. The next year, in 1972, Capitol Records would reissue the album on stereo vinyl for Canadian markets. And then the next year, in 1973, Odeon and Apple Records would jointly reissue the album on vinyl for Colombian markets, once again under the Las Escobas que Cantan title. That same year, we would get, or I should say specifically the Japanese, would get another vinyl reissue, mono press by Apple Records. And then the next year, in 1974, Odeon Records would reissue their Venezuelan import of the album. And that same year, there would be another Japanese import reissue, that one by Apple Records. And the next year, in 1975, Apple Records would once again reissue the album on vinyl, a stereo vinyl press for U.S. and Canadian markets. And the next year, in 1976, there would be another Apple reissue, a Capitol Records reissue on stereo vinyl in the U.S. and an Apple Records stereo reissue on vinyl in Japan. Very interesting how they would alternate. I find it very interesting. And then a couple years later, in 1978, Capitol Records would reissue the cassette edition of the album for U.S. markets, and they would also repress the vinyl for both U.S. and Canadian markets. In 1979, there would be another Mexican import reissue by Capitol Records, once again under the Kanazka a the Beatles title. In 1980, Capitol Records would reissue the album on vinyl once more for Mexican and Canadian markets. And the next year, in 81, Capitol Records, jointly with EMI, would reissue the album on LP. In 1982, the following year, Odeon Records would reissue the album on vinyl for Guatemalan markets. And in 1982, EMI would also reissue the album for Venezuelan markets. The next year, in 83, Capitol Records would reissue the album once more on vinyl for U.S. and Canadian markets. And the next year, EMI would once more reissue the album on vinyl for Venezuela. And then a couple years later, in 1986, Capitol Records would once more repress the album for U.S. and Mexican markets. The same year, Capitol Records would reissue the cassette, although that would be issued exclusively for U.S. markets. And then a couple years later, in 1988, Capitol Records would reissue both the cassette and LP for U.S. markets. And in 1991, there would be a further cassette reissue for U.S. markets, done jointly by Capitol and Apple Records. And after many years without seeing a reissue, in 2014, Apple Records, Capitol Records, and Universal Music Entertainment would remaster and reissue the album on limited edition CD for United States, Brazilian, and Argentinian markets. So the album has been heavily issued and reissued. Many of these, the longest stretch between them until the late 80s is, 2 years. So it's definitely been in heavy circulation. So I figure I'll forego SparkNote's bio on the Beatles themselves. I'm sure most of you are at least vaguely familiar with John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And if not, there are definitely sources that would provide a much better background than I could possibly give. But suffice it to say, these four young guys from Liverpool, England, got together and started making music and very quickly became a big deal. So this here, Meet the Beatles, is a seminal album in the history of popular music. This was the first album by the Beatles to be issued on Capitol Records, and also their second album to be released in the United States, only 10 days after the release of Introducing the Beatles on VJ Records. And as a result, this album consists mostly of songs from the group's second full-length United Kingdom album, With the Beatles, which had recently been issued November 22nd, 1963, so barely over a month prior to this. And it also included material both sides of their newest 45 RPM single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, which itself had just been issued the day after Christmas, 1963. Most tracks from the Beatles' actual first UK album, Please Please Me, and the early concurrent singles released around the time of that album would not see issue in US markets until the early Beatles album, 1965, aside from one track that is on this. And only one cover song would see inclusion on this album as well, at the insistence of the record label. So, on to the album itself, after I take a sip of tea here, bear with me. So, side A opens with I Want to Hold Your Hand, which is doubtlessly the flagship anchor song of the album, and the Beatles' first truly undeniable crossover breakout success hit single. Originally issued by Parlophone Records in UK markets on November 29th, 1963, exactly 1 week after the release of their second full-length album. It was issued as a single with This Boy, the song This Boy, on the B-side. And the song replaced their previous single, She Loves You, at the top of the UK singles charts for a 21-week run. And after being issued by Capitol Records in US markets, with I Saw Her Standing There on the B-side instead, the song would top the US Billboard Hot 100 for a 7-week run before being replaced by, ironically, She Loves You, the Beatles song, which had been issued for US markets a little bit earlier in September of 1963. The single would stay on the charts for a full 15 weeks and would go on to become the Beatles' biggest selling single worldwide. From the exciting raucous guitars in the introduction, the lively vocals, it has a big sound and production. It just, you hear it and it just begs the listener to sing along. And on that note, it also stands out as one of the few Beatle tracks without a lead singer per se, as John and Paul harmonize together throughout basically the whole song. Not only is this song a success on so many levels, but it's a perfect example of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team at work. In interviews years down the road, both John and Paul have spoken of the tight collaborative nature of this song in particular. John describing it as being written, quote, eyeball to eyeball, which is quite a visual. Upon its initial UK release to advance orders exceeding 1 million copies, the song was given early airplay on a handful of East Coast radio stations by well-connected disc jockeys, and Capitol Records would rush release the 45 single ahead of schedule, launching Beatlemania with 250,000 sales in only 3 days. The initial British release of the 45 was the first time a British group had replaced its own #1 record on the charts. In spite of the overwhelmingly enthusiastic response from consumers, most critical reviews were actually quite harsh on the song and on the Beatles, kind of dismissing them as a passing fad. How wrong that notion was. But all things considered, the song would still be nominated for the 1964 Grammy Award for Record of the Year, ultimately losing to The Girl from Ipanema by Astrid Gilberto and Stan Getz, which is fair. The song would begin a 7-song streak of #1 singles for the Beatles by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team in the year of 1964, an all-time record for most #1 songs in the same calendar year. And I could go on. There's so many, records that were broken or established by this song. It's really the impact of this song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, is so massive, in a lot of ways arguably bigger than the song itself. It's a great, timeless song all the same. Another sip of tea here for the working man. The following track, I Saw Her Standing There, is the only material from the Beatles' original first UK album, Please Please Me, to see release on this collection. Capitol Records chose to issue the song as the B-side of the I Wanna Hold Your Hand 45 RPM single in US markets. And it actually even made the rare B-side Billboard chart placement, reaching number 14 on the charts. Once again, this is another product of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team. The song actually originated with Paul, who admitted to pinching the bass riff from Chuck Berry's I'm Talking About You, which, pardon me, it is a hell of a bass riff. It's honestly one of my favorite parts of the whole song, so good on Paul for grabbing that riff. But he himself worked out the chords and arrangement prior to finishing the lyrics with Lennon. It's, in my opinion, one of the most exciting and rocking of the early Beatles repertoire. The band really just cooks on this song. We get trademark Beatles shouts and wails, and followed by a downright smoking rock and roll guitar solo from George. Honestly, it's one of my favorite early George guitar bits on this song. Paul's enigmatic count-in at the beginning really just sets the mental image of the band absolutely ripping it up on stage in this song. Definitely one of my personal favorite early Beatle rock and roll cuts. The next track, This Boy, was originally released as the B-side of the I Wanna Hold Your Hand 45 in UK markets. Only given release on Meet the Beatles, this LP, in American markets. And it's a much, much softer, slower, and sweeter song. Lennon has actually been cited as claiming that when writing this song, as well as a couple others in this time period that I will point out, but when writing this song, he was actually emulating the style of Motown Records singer and songwriter Smokey Robinson, leaning heavily into close doo-wop style harmonies. And as a result, we get another highlight of the album and another one of my personal favorite early Beatle tracks. The song was prominently featured with an instrumental and easy listening arrangement in the Beatles' 1964 film A Hard Day's Night, during a sequence centering around Ringo Starr. This version in the film, orchestrated by the Beatles' producer George Martin, would also be issued as a promotional 45 in July of 1964. Actually issued July 1st, the week before the theatrical premiere of A Hard Day's Night in the film. Issued under the title Ringo's Theme, a parenthetical, This Boy, with another instrumental and easy listening arrangement of the song And I Love Her on the B-side. That single charted at number 53 on the U.S. Billboard charts. But in any iteration, instrumental or vocal, this is one of the earliest songs by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team that I would make the argument for it being truly beautiful. I cannot overlook the power in John Lennon's vocals as they swell in the bridge of the original. It's just incredible. It's great stuff. The next track, It Won't Be Long, was originally issued as the opening cut on the group's second UK album with the Beatles. The song just blasts out of the speakers with reckless abandon and unrelenting energy. The hype of the call and response vocals, the back and forth, yes. There's so many touchstones and trademarks of early Beatles songwriting, all right here in this song. And even while this isn't my favorite song on the album, it certainly loses none of the sense of excitement that permeates these songs. It's got a lot of momentum. When Lennon sings "You're Coming Home" in the bridge, it really sounds like he's about to sing himself right out of his body. It's dynamite stuff. I like it. The next track, All I've Got to Do, was also originally issued on the With the Beatles album, and is another instance of Lennon trying his hand at the style of Motown Records icon Smokey Robinson. And he really landed it here, in my opinion. This sounds like a song the Miracles could and would do. This really has the feel of a classic Motown groove, but through the lens of British beat. And also, I should mention that in spite of being a track with Lennon as the principal songwriter, the bass guitar parts kind of cement the song. So Paul must have been very involved in the final arrangement. This song has always stood out to me, and to this day is one of my favorites from this era of the early Beatles. Definitely a great cut and has a whole lot of soul. The following track, All My Loving, was another track pulled from the With the Beatles album, and though not issued as a 45 RPM single in either the UK or US markets, it received enough airplay, radio airplay, to prompt a 45 issue in Canadian markets. And that Canadian 45, would apparently see import into U.S. shops, U.S. record shops, in enough quantities and high enough volume to reach number 45 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100 in April of 1964, which is very impressive. Charting with a song that wasn't even sold in America. But this is another song that originates with Paul McCartney. He has said in interviews that it's one of the few songs he's written where the words came before the music. I always find it interesting how some songwriters are, typically the words come first, or typically the music comes first. So, in Paul's case, typically the music comes first. It's got a nice walking bass line from Paul. We have very strong, swinging drums from Ringo. More of George's vaguely rockabilly guitar, but technically proficient rockabilly guitar, and very dynamite, quick rhythm guitar from John. So the group honestly really shine instrumentally on this track. They shine as instrumentalists on this song, and this would also be the first song that the band would perform on their first Ed Sullivan Show appearance on February 9th, 1964, which means that for most Americans in the early 60s, the song All My Loving was their introduction to the Beatles. which is not a bad introduction at all. And so with that, we end side A. And side B opens with Don't Bother Me, which was, it has the distinction of being the first George Harrison composition to see release on record. Written in late summer of 1963, while sick in bed. This song finds George leaning into a more despondent and downer attitude, which was quite unconventional for the Beatles up to this point. With all their happy pop songs, and even their ballads, are not exactly downers at this point, anyway. But the guitar sound on this track, I gotta mention, it's uniquely dark and somewhat dirty sounding guitar. Apparently achieved with the use of a compressor and a tremolo from Mr. Lennon. In addition to Ringo's drums, the band also overdubbed extra percussion. John on tambourine, Paul on claves, and Ringo on bongos, all giving the song's rhythm something of a vaguely Latin feel, which is pretty unique for early Beatles material. And all things considered, it's a fine songwriting debut from George, and surprisingly consistent with the direction his songwriting would take in years to come. The next track, Little Child, was originally featured on the With the Beatles album, originally written by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting team with the intention of being a song sung by Ringo. And for whatever reason, this plan was abandoned, and ultimately Lennon would take the lead vocal on the song. It's worth noting that in addition to bass guitar, Paul McCartney plays overdubbed piano on the track. Heavy use of harmonica and sudden 12-bar blues guitar solo give the song an interesting British blues feel. Kind of almost like a proto-Yardbirds, dare I say, but leaning much heavier towards pop, but still with a lot of those blues elements lingering around. However, all this being said, even McCartney himself kind of disregarded the song, describing it as album filler. And I can certainly say, it's certainly not an album highlight, but it's a fun, even exciting track all the same. Definitely the kind of thing you could see people getting excited about if they were gonna see it live. That said, the next track, Till There Was You, is the only cover song on the album. Originally written by Meredith Willson, American composer and conductor and arranger and band leader and playwright and author, best known for writing the hit Broadway musical The Music Man, in which this song appears. The song has been covered by several orchestras and singers over the decades. The very first ever issue by Nelson Riddle and his orchestra, almost a month ahead of the Broadway premiere of The Music Man. McCartney himself had allegedly first encountered the song through the 1961 Peggy Lee cover version, which the group presumably based their arrangement and performance around. Paul would go on to claim that he was unaware until much later that the song was even featured in The Music Man, which I find kind of hilarious. But on the studio recording, which was also originally included on the With the Beatles album, John and George each play nylon string acoustic guitars, and in lieu of a full drum set, Ringo simply plays bongos. And all this, the guitar, the nylon string guitars, and the bongos give this song, again, a vaguely Spanish feel. It definitely stands out in that regard from most of the rest of the album, in that kind of Spanish feel. In the next track, Hold Me Tight, was another cut from the With the Beatles album, primarily written by McCartney. The group actually attempted to record the song for inclusion on their first UK album, Please Please Me, but the results were ultimately trashed, and the group returned to this song for the second album recording sessions. And in spite of the fact that they chose to come back to this song after not using it, both John and Paul seemed to continue to hold the song in low regard. John claiming to hardly remember the song in interviews years later, and Paul referring to it as, quote, a failed attempt at a single, which then became an acceptable album filler. Not exactly high praise. But in any case, though certainly not the crown jewel of any Beatle album, the track has no shortage of that exuberance and excitement, I keep mentioning, that defines early Beatles recordings. Maybe not impressive, but fun all the same. The following track, I Wanna Be Your Man, was also pulled from the With the Beatles album. Written by Lennon and McCartney, the song was immediately given to the Rolling Stones, who recorded and issued the track as their second 45 RPM single, released in UK markets November 1st, 1963. The single would peak at number 12 on the British singles charts, and on January 1st, 1964, it would actually be the first song ever performed on the BBC's Top of the Pops program. The Beatles would go on to issue their own recording of the song just a few short weeks after the Stones, making the song Ringo's vocal spot on With the Beatles, and by extension, Meet the Beatles. John was predictably dismissive of the song in interviews later in his life, calling it, quote, a throwaway. It should not go without mention that the Beatles producer George Martin plays Hammond organ on the track. So that's cool. And the following track, Not a Second Time, was another cut from the With the Beatles album, written chiefly by John Lennon as part of his Motown Records, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles emulation. The song has been praised for its surprisingly sophisticated chord changes, especially in the piano parts played by Beatles producer George Martin. I do think it's nice that we get a couple tracks here with him playing. I enjoy his musicianship, and as he's been called the fifth Beatle by many a fan, and as far as being on record, he is being on record and being producer. He has certainly earned it. And this song actually has, interestingly enough, as I was doing my research for this video, the song kind of elicited a bit of a heady, more somewhat sophisticated review of the Beatles' music. One of the first really positive reviews they got in their early days in the American press, where they were complimented for utilizing Aeolian cadences in the song Not a Second Time, and it's particularly hilarious that, again, even up to his very last interview, John Lennon spoke about this particular critique, saying that, they say it has Aeolian cadences, and to this day I still have no idea what Aeolian cadences are. They sound like birds. It cracks me up. But I digress. In any case, it's a fine song. Certainly not my favorite, but it's easily better than what I would expect from a group pumping out as much material as they were at this point in time. And with this song as well, with those bird-like Aeolian cadences, we end side B and the album. So, final thoughts after I take another sip of tea here. This is a watershed moment in the history of popular music, this album is. The release of this album was the opening of the gates for Beatlemania. Though undeniably somewhat disjointed in its sequencing and reshuffling of tracks, the loss of cohesion from the original UK albums does little to lessen the overall quality of this album. We get bits of early Beatle rock and roll, heaping helpings of R&B flavored Mercy Beat, and even a bit of proto-British blues. Like I said, kind of teasing and hinting at a direction that would be further explored by groups like the Yardbirds. And, as I mentioned, we get bits of that R&B Motown sound with the Mercy Beat flavor. And we get bits of that Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly influenced rock and roll. So we get enough, we pull material from enough different sources that give the album a more varied feel with the different styles that the group touched on throughout the year of 1963. Because even though, I'm not about to, argue that they were more diverse here, they definitely got way more experimental and diverse in the following years. But still, you get a little more different flavor on this album. You even get a little bit of that Latin flavor, as I've mentioned on a couple tracks here. So it's definitely not a... listening to their US albums is not necessarily worse than listening to their UK iterations of their albums. The Meet the Beatles album itself, I should also say, actually outsold the I Wanna Hold Your Hand 45 single in US markets, which was the first ever American instance of a group's full-length LP outselling their hit 45 single, which in some ways kind of indicated the direction of album-oriented rock music, as full-length albums would become the dominant medium for popular music sales over 45 RPM records in the coming years. So in a lot of ways, there's so many changes that were to come in the 60s that were foretold, foreshadowed, could be predicted from this album and its release. It definitely signaled a big change in a whole lot of ways. So, a little bit of a closer look here. The cover is basically the same as the With the Beatles album, except, they've replaced With the Beatles with Meet the Beatles. And they mention how, hey, this is England's phenomenal pop combo. And the cover itself, the picture of the boys, this very stark, dynamite picture, is actually tinted a little blue, whereas on the original album, it's just plain black and white. And the back cover is basically, just a nice picture of the boys, the tracks, publishing times, the text again, and a little blurb just kind of talking about the Beatles and how big they are and how people love them and how people will camp out for days at a time to get tickets, and how there was an actress that brushed up against one of the Fab Four and people were kissing her hand and all sorts of goofy crap like that. Sliding out the record here. It's on the Rainbow Capital label. Nothing too crazy to write home about, but she looks nice, doesn't she? Oops, I got that's the right side. So yeah, this is, as I've said, a hell of an album for many, many reasons, and in many, many ways. I can't even imagine how different the world would be without this album. I can't even imagine how many people have held this album in their hands and listened to it and pored over the liner notes, and its place in the history of the culture of popular music is cemented for all eternity and cannot be overstated or overlooked. And like I said, it's, obviously very, very rooted in the pop breakout success of the Beatles, but you have so much of their early rhythm and blues and rock and roll influences still readily apparent, and so much of their ambition and excitement for what's yet to come very clear as well. So, it's hard for me to, give this as good a rating as I really want to. All things considered, I would probably rate this a solid 7 out of 10. Like I said, we get a few of their early singles and most of their second album. The entire second side of this is culled from their second album, their second British album, I should say. But this album is, God, monolithic seems like the wrong word, but this album is special. Let's just say special. And I've been rambling about it here for a hell of a long time now. It's been well over 40 minutes, so I'll wrap up here. Let me say thank you to any and all listeners. I appreciate any and all viewership. I'll keep them coming at you if you keep tuning in. And this has been Matthew Buckley Talks Music with Meet the Beatles. Music is the best.